I think we'll start because there's a lot to get through and we only have an hour. So good afternoon and welcome to this third lecture of CVSP 202. CVSP courses are designed to provide an interdisciplinary engagement with ideas that have shaped human existence across different periods and cultures through the reading of great books or classics. The selection and ordering of these texts is not neutral. Obviously, it already is a way of telling a particular story. Therefore, it should always be open to interpretation and even contestation. Why this author or not the other one? Why this text and not another? Why at this point in the semester? I'm sure you've thought about such questions and perhaps even addressed them in your sections. My name is Gubara. I teach in the CVSP program here, but I'm also an intellectual historian by specialization. So I'm especially interested in these questions of canon formation, of how knowledge is produced, ordered, etc. Why and how historians decide that such and such a theme or author is important or representative of a time and place is precisely what I research and write about. And I always begin with the premise that history is a dialogue between the past and the present. A specific historical narrative tells a story about the past, that's true, but it also says something about the present. And in that sense, it is important to stress that what I will be presenting to you today is only one interpretation among many. And I hope that in your sections, with your section leaders, you will explore other possible versions and that you will compare those essentially to mine and reflect upon it all. So let us take the case of reading the readings for CVSP 202 so far. Now, you began with antiquity and philosophy, represented by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, as a philosophical background to what would be the monotheistic traditions. You then moved to early Christianity, embodied in the figure of St. Augustine, and now you've arrived at this week's readings on something that is called in your syllabus classical Islamic thought, featuring Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali. This selection of texts and themes is obviously already full of meaning. To begin with, it seeks to create connections between these texts. The terms themselves are full of meaning too. The idea of classical Islamic thought is usually meant to refer to a certain period, roughly the 9th to the 10th centuries AD, which is known as the Golden Age of Islam, or Al-Asr al-Dhahabi. This is a period when Islam's essential features and greatest contributions to human civilization were said to have been made. After this period, Islamic thought and civilization are again said to have entered a long period of decline, or inhitat, until the more recent efforts at European-led modernization that begin in the late 19th century. This paradigm is deeply problematic, and scholarship, in fact, has pretty much contested it, thrown it out the window. And I'd like to begin instead with a different point of departure. Rather than having to define what's classical about the thought of Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali, I would like us to think of them as, let's say, classics of Islamic thought, forcing us, in other words, to reflect on how and why they speak to us today. For what else is a classic other than a connecting thread between the past, however distant and different, and the present, however joyful or bleak it might appear? And it's pretty bleak, I'd say, right now. My main question to you, then, is, do we read Ikhwan al-Safa and al-Ghazali just as representatives of 10th century thought or 12th century thought in Islamic history, or can reading them resonate with us still today? Can we find something stimulating and interesting in them today? In order to help us with this problem, I want to introduce you to two important ideas that will frame the rest of my lecture: late antiquity and Islam as a tradition. These ideas are complicated, complex, difficult even, and multi-layered, so bear with me as I work through them, and please don't hesitate to ask for clarifications. Now, the first question we are faced with when studying a text is clearly to identify its context, the time, place, and the cultural world of its writing. In our case here, this begins inevitably with the revelation of the Quran. As you all know, Islam arose in a narrow stretch of the Hijaz, the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but expanded with lightning speed into other Middle Eastern regions and beyond, as you can see, for example, in this map. Two broad approaches to the history of early Islam have been dominant. One view sees Islam as a specifically Arabian religion. The other argues that it was so profoundly influenced by its contact with the established Byzantine and Persian cultures that the Islam of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, these are famous dynasties in Islamic history, bears little relation to its original native land. These positions may appear opposite, but they share something crucial in common. They both rely on the assumption that Arabia was marginal and isolated from its surroundings. By contrast, more recent studies insist that the Arabian Peninsula was in fact part and parcel of that late antique world that stretched over the entire domains once unified by Alexander the Great, whom you may recall as the famous student of Aristotle. A large geographical area crisscrossed by long-standing and wide-ranging networks of exchanges. In other words, we are not dealing here with the startling and almost incomprehensible emergence from the darkness of some isolated desert of a nomadic people armed merely with the sword and the word of some fierce god. Culturally and linguistically polyglot, connected for centuries by trade routes, pilgrimage routes, imperial expansion and contraction, the world of late antique Arabia was a space where ancient thought and religions competed and coalesced with monotheistic traditions of various thoughts. In fact, even here at AUB, our late colleague, the famous historian Kamal Salibi, made a famous and somewhat controversial argument that the Bible itself came from Arabia. But without going into such big questions, think a little bit about the story of the Kaaba. The Kaaba is obviously the famous house of God, or the black box that you see on TV, in other words. The story is that the Kaaba was rebuilt not long before the Islamic revelation, before Muhammad's mission began, supposedly by a Greek, Egyptian, and an Ethiopian carpenter. The simple fact that we can imagine a Greek, Egyptian, and Ethiopian carpenter in Mecca in the 7th century already shows how open the Hijaz was to the outside world. But it is important to think of this notion of late antiquity not just as a space of lived interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, involving political, social, economic, and cultural relations. Crucially, it was also a space where ideas and concepts and ideologies and words and memories and stories also flowed with ease. In this sense, late antiquity is not merely a chronological epoch, a time period, if you like. It is an epistemic space, too. And what I mean by that is that it is a space where knowledge-making, the practices of making knowledge, shared common parameters regarding the conditions, the intellectual, material, and institutional conditions that make any knowledge or any truth claim possible. Universities, texts, teachers, etc. Okay? It is in this multicultural and multifaceted universe that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in 570 AD, and in due course would oversee the founding of yet a new tradition, after beginning to receive revelation in his 40th year. Indeed, the Quran itself is perhaps the greatest single testimony to this diverse world of late antique Arabia, insofar as it consciously formulates itself as a continuation of the older universal message conveyed through a long series of prophets that reaches its culmination with Muhammad as Khatim al-Anbiya. And it is in both its language and subject matter a text that is in dialogue continuously with its context. Moreover, In the course of the following centuries, following Muhammad, a dedicated effort would be launched to make accessible in Arabic as much as possible from the intellectual production of the older traditions of thought. Often described simply as the translation movement, thousands of foundational texts were translated into Arabic, mostly from Greek, but also from Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and other languages, especially in Abbasid Baghdad. It is this cumulative effect, it is the cumulative effect of these developments that forms the intellectual landscape within which our authors wrote their texts. But the main point to keep in mind concerning this translation movement is that however monumentally important it was, and indeed it was very important, it built upon already existing trends of cultural, religious, and linguistic intermingling, including in pre-Islamic Arabia. So to sum up our first crucial point then, Islam is not some bizarre ideology that jumped out of an empty desert and had to then deal with the higher cultures of late antiquity, be they Persian or Byzantine or whatever. It was in fact part and parcel of it from the very start. Understanding the emergence of Islam as belonging to this world of late antiquity requires what historians call an appreciation of deep time and broad space that this concept invokes, given its emphasis on continuities with the past. The very idea of late antiquity, therefore, is an incitement to think about the shared commonalities of various cultures, texts, and traditions. And this is one of the ways that the text we're reading can speak to us today, asking us to think beyond the all too common clash of civilizations. But the matter is not that simple. It's not just a group hug, if you like, kind of philosophy. Because we also know that Jews are not the same as Christians, and Christians are not the same as pagans, and pagans are certainly not the same as Muslims. So that it is equally important to recognize and explain the differences involved between and within different traditions. Muhammad's project articulated itself as a distinct revolution, cut off in many ways from the past out of which it emerged, which it now called the Jahiliyyah, or the time of ignorance. A very practical example of this would be the introduction of a whole new calendar, the Hijri calendar, the first year of which begins with the emigration of the Prophet and his small community of believers from Mecca to the neighboring town of Yathrib, which will soon become known simply as Al-Madinah, or Al-Madinah al-Munawwara. The new calendar marked the founding of the new Islamic community led by the Prophet, obviously, but it also marked it off from the other traditions around it. So simply folding Islam uncritically within some all-inclusive notion of late antiquity clearly will not do. It would both deny the originality of the new teachings and would prove unfaithful to the historical sources and the actors involved. The challenge, then, is to find a way to make sense of both propositions together, to juxtapose them, in other words, by taking seriously both the continuity and coherence of late antiquity as a shared epistemic space, but also the radical break from the past that is involved in the affirmation of any new tradition. And this is where thinking through the notion of Islam as a tradition seems important to me. By tradition, I do not mean the common understanding of the word as that which is old and unchanging, as opposed to something that's modern and new and dynamic, right? Rather, what I mean by tradition is an arena, a space that sustains in ways both conscious and unconscious a particular mode of life, a mode of thought, a particular way of being, a way of thinking that are continually in dialogue with the founding texts of the tradition, the Quran and the Sunnah. In the case of Islam, the founding texts are, of course, the Quran, or the revelation, the eternal word of God that predates time and space, but that was consecutively revealed to humans since the dawn of time, and the Sunnah, the deeds and sayings of the Prophet that are transmitted to the community as a central authority on how to live a Muslim life. These two elements form the linchpin of Islamic tradition across the centuries, and they remain central to it to this day. But what is crucial about tradition in this sense is that it is not opposed to reason. It is rather the very condition that makes rational thinking possible. In other words, tradition is never fixed or static. Debate and change are integral to it. And this is why questions relating to whether this or that is halal, haram, or makruh are constantly negotiated in Islamic settings. From the simplest questions, such as, is smoking acceptable, can I wear jeans, etc., to the most serious and the most profound questions. Is free market economics a good thing? What should our relationship be to the environment? What is the best way to reach the truth of things? And this is another way that these texts are classics, in fact. And this is how they speak to us today, because they demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that tradition and reason are not mutually contradictory, so that the world can just not be neatly divided into unthinking religious types and thinking secular rational types. And it's precisely this that allows a certain intellectual continuity and a universality of thought from Plato and before to Muhammad and beyond, to stand in balance with a firm affirmation of the particular singularity of Islam and the preoccupation with forging a community, defining who's in, who's out, what are its aims, its forms of being, of knowing, of acting, of making, etc., all things that we can now call Islamic. This balance between the old and the new has preoccupied Muslim thinkers in various ways from the start. And it is this epistemic challenge that characterizes Muhammad's prophetic mission itself. But it would become even more acute following his death, a foundational moment in the tradition as the new ummah had to fend for itself without the direct presence of prophetic authority, and would itself soon extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. A huge geographical span of enormous cultural diversity which the tradition had to engage. Think about this a little bit. The same founding texts, the Quran and the Sunnah, will mean something both quite similar and yet quite different in Senegal than they would in, say, Indonesia. There was almost from the start then different positions on this fundamental question of how to balance the old and the new. These are often framed with broad labels such as rationalists, those who appeal above all to human reason, traditionalists, those who assert the primacy of transmitted tradition, legalists, those who adopt a legal interpretation or a fiqh-based interpretation of the scripture, and mystics, those who emphasize a more spiritual mode of religious life or an esoteric way of knowing. These labels are both helpful and problematic in equal measure. And again, you may wish to discuss this more fully in your classes. But for us here, what is important to highlight once more is the common fundamental question that undergirds them collectively. How is knowledge, including pre-Islamic and non-Islamic knowledge, to be grounded in tradition? So to end this section on tradition and late antiquity, we might pose the following question. How does one justify or legitimize knowledge as one perceives it in its immediacy, as you come across it immediately, or as you apprehend it, as you think it, right? But also as you receive it from the many pasts before? Or, to put it another way, what is the relationship between al-manqul, transmitted knowledge, and al-ma'qul, interpretive knowledge? And I hesitate deliberately to use the more common translation of ma'qul as rational knowledge, because again, there is nothing irrational about transmitted knowledge. The key question then, to put it more simply, is how do I know that what I know is true? How can I arrive at certainty in knowing? And this is precisely what I mean by epistemic certainty. These are fundamental questions of human existence, and it is because the texts you are reading this week deal with these questions that they are still able to stimulate us many, many centuries later. So let's turn to the texts now. Ikhwan al-Safa, Little is known about the group of anonymous Muslim intellectuals who call themselves Ikhwan al-Safa wa Kullan al-Wafa wa Ahli al-Hamd wa Abna al-Majd, the brethren of purity, the loyal friends, the people of praise, and the sons of glory. Their importance stems from their having collectively authored an important work, an encyclopedia of sorts, in which they attempted to gather and classify all knowledge that was available during their time in the form of 52 epistles or tracts known simply as the Rasail. Sectioned into 4 broad subject fields, the epistles cover a wide range of topics and disciplines, from arithmetic and geometry, logic, physics, astronomy, magic, natural philosophy and geography, to music, metaphysics, ethics, theology, politics, pedagogy, mysticism. Really, you could run out of breath listing the scope of the encyclopedia of the Ikhwan. Now, operating as a secret society, the members of this group met regularly to partake in intellectual pursuits and rituals that drew from a wide array of cultures, all in the spirit of brotherhood and mutual aid between a socially diverse collective of seekers of knowledge, which saw themselves as united in an ostensible spiritual city, a mystical utopia of sorts, which they called Dawlat al-Khair, the abode of the good. Beyond this, the Ikhwan remain very much an enigma, so that practically everything that we know of them is a matter of scholarly speculation. This begins with their actual identities, which they deliberately kept secret, and extends to their intellectual, political, sectarian, and creedal affiliations. The speculation even involves such simple facts as the period and place in which they were writing. Although there is now some general consensus emerging that the brethren were based in the cities of Basra and Baghdad in modern-day Iraq, and were active roughly sometime around the last quarter of the 10th century. By contrast, we know a great deal more about our second author. Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali is one of the most celebrated scholars of Islam. World famous already in his time, his imprint on the development of Islamic thought earned him the honorific title of Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, and the renewer, the mujaddid of the faith. This places al-Ghazali among some of the greatest celebrities in Islam's historic hall of fame, and it ensures the continuing relevance of his thought and his writings to the present by supporters and detractors alike. In other words, love him or hate him, you have to contend with him. Al-Ghazali was born into a family of modest means in the village of Ghazale on the outskirts of Tus in today's northwestern Iran in 1058. Orphaned at a young age, he received an elementary education in Tus before traveling to Jurjan and then Nishapur, where he undertook an extensive program of study under the city's most leading scholars. Within a few years, Al-Ghazali had already begun to make a name for himself as a leading scholar, a prolific writer, and an impressive teacher. This earned him the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks. The Seljuks are a dynasty that controlled vast territories, but under the kind of nominal sovereignty, if you like, of the Abbasids. Nizam al-Mulk invited him to teach at the newly founded educational college in Baghdad, Al-Madrasa al-Nizamiyya. And it's kind of like the Harvard of its time, if you want to think of it in those terms. Reaching the summit, or the AUB, incidentally. Reaching the summit of his professional career, he suddenly undergoes a severe crisis and decides to retreat from teaching and public life. He reflects upon the reasons for this withdrawal in the text that you're reading, weaving together a personal or spiritual explanation with an intellectual one. If you're beginning to see parallels here with Augustine, then you're paying attention, because both these figures would come to represent a particular strand of philosophical thought that is broadly identified as medieval skepticism. He abandoned his position in his family and embarked on a long period, over a decade of ascetic wanderings, which took him from Baghdad to Syria, Palestine, the Hijaz, and finally back to Tus. You can see that roughly kind of mapped out on this map here. Now, it was during this period that Al-Ghazali authored his most famous work, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, in which he reflected on the relationship between law, theology, and mysticism, or tasawwuf, and which, along with his early works on jurisprudence, on fiqh, and his two main philosophical works, Maqasid al-Falasifa, where he expounds the Neoplatonist ideas of the Muslim philosophers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he sets about debunking many of their main tenets, secured his enduring legacy as both a highly revered and a highly controversial figure. The text before you on Munqidh min ad-Dalal, or the deliverance from error, was written a few years before his death in 1111 AD. He was reportedly buried in the Haruniya complex in Tus, which you see here, where his mausoleum is said to still stand. Now, hailing from seemingly different backgrounds, experiences, and intellectual milieus, and separated by shifting geographical locations, and at least a century of time, and an eventful century at that, our authors may appear to represent two separate strands of classical Islamic thought. One that is syncretically grounded in philosophical ideas and forms of spirituality, and freely espousing an ecumenical, liberal spirit of tolerance that blended monotheistic and non-monotheistic cultures and beliefs, and the other characterized by an ambivalence towards philosophy and more concerned with maintaining some kind of orthodoxy that wants to accommodate mysticism and legalism. The variances are clear also in the two texts before you, which belong to very different genres of writing. The first is a literary narrative in the form of a well-known satirical fable, a satire, aimed at delivering an ethical and ecological message. The second is a self-conscious intellectual tract that deliberates on the meaning and methods of true knowledge, that is punctuated by autobiographical references and written at the behest of a student's request. All of these differences concerning the context of the authors and the form, content, genesis, and reception of their ideas over time are, of course, important, and I suspect you will discuss them at some length in your individual sections. Here, I'd like to suggest to you, keeping in mind what I've already said about change and continuity, that these two texts ultimately share a fundamental unity as knowledge-making projects. In the time left, I will highlight a few details that point in that direction before concluding on their implications. The case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. In Epistle 22 of the Rasail, and after a brief introductory universal history setting the gradual abuse of the earth by mankind, the Ikhwan present an allegorical fable involving an arbitration, much like a modern court case, in which animals submit a complaint about their mistreatment at the hands of the sons of Adam to the king of the jinn. The jinn is a type of being who exists in a parallel dimension and are said to exercise supernatural influence upon men. Okay, so the humans and the animals are both summoned before the king of the jinn and a jury of philosophers, poets, magicians, and other mendicants to present their case. The human spokesman begins by asserting, "These cattle, beasts of prey, and wild creatures, all animals, in fact, are our slaves. We are their masters. Some have rebelled and escaped, others obey grudgingly, and they scorn our service." When asked by the king to put forward the proof or evidence that backs up this claim, the human representative responds, "Your Majesty, we have both traditional religious arguments and rational proofs for our position." "Very well. Let's hear them," the king replies. And from here, the drama unfolds, with the animal representatives headed by the mule, and this, by the way, is also a very interesting choice of animal, begin to challenge each and every argument that the humans put forward. From the onset, then, the question of epistemic certainty, the basis or truth of knowledge, and its relationship to both demonstrative proof on the one hand, and arguments that are derived from revelation and prophetic authority, or from the Quran and the Sunnah, on the other, foregrounds the events that ensue. Interestingly, what transpires is not simply some sequential deployment of two types of methods in the arguments that are advanced by the two camps. Something like, here's my religious argument, and if that doesn't work, well, here's my rational one, right? It's not that. That's not what's happening here. Rather, a seamless integration of the two forms of argumentation. Demonstrative reasoning lies at the basis of the speech of both parties, just as they both always couch their discourse in references to scriptural and prophetic utterances. So smoothly is this effected that in the end, the only point of distinction pivots on not on whether using scripture makes for a rational argument in and of itself, but on the nature of the interpretation of the scripture. In other words, their tafsir, the extent to which it privileges a manifest or literal interpretation, a zahir interpretation, or a deeper, more esoteric or hidden reading, a batin interpretation. Instances of this are tangible in almost all the arguments discussed through the use of the constant line used by the animals, but only those who are well-rooted in knowledge can comprehend. More telling, perhaps, is the example in chapter 5 entitled "The Animals Charge Humans with Oppression," which begins with an interesting challenge of the idea of natural slavery, the proposition that some beings are essentially and inherently unequal and therefore are natural slaves to others. To debunk the human claim that their mastery over the animals is a given, because the animals depend on them for food, water, shelter, etc., the animals deploy a new method of proof, a recurrent chain or silsila of testimonies or testimonials, one after the other from all the creatures present. So first the ass, then the ox and the ram, the elephant, the horse, even the accursed and grotesque pig, who Ya Haram has the most to complain about. This method of deducing evidence drawn from eyewitness accounts, extended over time, is well established in the fiqh, in the Islamic law, and in the science of hadith. And it would come to characterize the very idea of learning itself in the Islamic tradition. Crucially, this method relies on the primacy not of the knowledge itself, its intrinsic truthfulness or not, right? But precisely on the tawatur, the repetition of transmissions through a chain of reliable and, most importantly, trustworthy speakers, a point which was also deliberated on at length by Al-Ghazali when he discusses tradition. These issues of method are again woven into discussions of other themes which the Ikhwan take up. For instance, the fable's location in the encyclopedia coming as it does under the section entitled Physical and Natural Sciences, demonstrates an engagement with Greek, notably Aristotelian, philosophical and zoological ideas that would make their way into Islamic writings. At the same time, the fable is a satire, is a didactic literary tool. What I mean by that is that it's a tool that is designed to instruct. Okay, that's designed to comment on various aspects of the human condition and to admonish to higher moral ideas that are rendered in a more simple or accessible form. Recall, for instance, stories that you may have been told when you were little about the slow and persistent tortoise who wins the race while the hare kind of takes a nap. I don't know if any of you remember that story, right? Or the story of Al-Ghurab al-Nabi. Yeah? These are all fables or simple renditions of very important moral messages. And the form of the fable becomes the means by which to communicate that moral message. Okay? Fables, then, are by definition able to cross cultural and historical boundaries, precisely because at their kernel is a deeper, enduring message that is seen as a universal truth. In the case of the animals versus man, the basic message is loud and clear. Humans must answer for the consequences of their willful and destructive treatment of the earth and its non-human inhabitants. But for the Ikhwan, this is just the starting point. for they're able to weave into their story several other levels of interpretation. These involve larger cosmological doctrines about the relationship between the creator and the created, and as asserted in the Quran, where man is enjoined to reflect on the reality of the divine through his ayat, or signs, so that the ultimate fount of all knowledge is the divine, who emanates or reveals himself in full glory. Likewise, the ultimate purpose of knowledge is asserted in the fable on two levels. The first is the earthly domain of happiness, harmony, and peace, what you can think of as the kind of social or political level. And we see this played out in the fable's meditation on the nature of the just ruler, personified in part by the figure of the wise, merciful king of the jinn, who regulates through law and presides over a harmonious realm, and whose authority is recognized by both parties to the dispute. That's why they go to him in the first place. And in the disentangling of such things as the meaning of power and submission, mastery and bondage, tyranny and mercy, truth, falsehood, ignorance, etc., and whether these are fixed or essential attributes, or whether they are instead accidental and ephemeral, and therefore can be corrected through some program of social and political and pedagogical reform. All these points, by the way, are bulleted in your fly sheet. Okay. The second level we might think of is the level of individual salvation. So if we've got this level of epistemic certainty or knowledge, the next level being the level of the social, the communal, the final level is the level of the individual's own salvation. Okay? The ultimate end of Al-Ikhwan's soteriology is just another fancy way of saying relating to salvation. Okay? So the Ikhwan's soteriological outlook is the fulfillment of God's promise in the final return of all souls to their master. It is this, in the end, that gives credence to their insistence on friendship and mutual assistance amongst mankind in order to fulfill the trust that is given to them by God, the earth and its bounties, and their covenantal, their aqidah, duty to know and worship Him alone. There is clearly much more that can be said about this fascinating text, but we must now turn quickly to Al-Ghazali, who shares these same three levels of interpretation. The issue of method, truth being contingent upon demonstrative proof, anchored in revelation, the question of the social ends of knowledge, and finally, the individual concern for salvation in the world to come. Al-Ghazali's Munqidh min al-Dalal, or the deliverance from error, is delivered in an autobiographical mode at the supposed behest of a fellow knowledge seeker. It is written in the first person singular and recounts the basic steps of the author's intellectual journey. The text pivots around a moment of crisis, during which the author suffered an attack of severe doubt that led him to question the most basic truths, those derived from tradition, those derived from sensory experience, and reason alike. To those of you who will take CVSP 203, from the second sequence, you may want to note here the remarkable similarities of this part of the text with René Descartes' later account. Al-Ghazali's argument, then, seeks to examine and challenge what the author sees as three major types of truth claims, leaving mysticism aside for a minute. Okay? Three major types of truth claims, based on 1, theology, kalam, 2, authoritative instruction or ta'lim, and 3, philosophy or falsafa. The first he dismisses for being merely defensive, the second for being unreasonable, and the third for being incoherent. None of these approaches, in other words, could provide him with a firm grounding for absolute truth. And it is important to remember here that Al-Ghazali's point is not necessarily to reject the conclusions of these various schools wholesale, even though he engages in what might appear to be polemics. That's not his intention, I think, in my reading at least. But simply to find an anchor for truth in what he describes as a profound and treacherous sea of knowledge. He draws continually on scripture, he embraces theology, of course, and he confirms the importance of the authority of an infallible imam, which for him can only be the prophet, precisely because of the primacy he gives to the idea of prophecy, to which he dedicates several pages in the text. Most importantly, he explicitly acknowledges the veracity or the truthfulness of most of the propositions of the philosophers, the problem with them being rather, in his view, the dangerous implications of their teachings for the untrained, gullible reader, either total acceptance, including all the non-Islamic elements, in his opinion, or rejection, making Islam ultimately irrational. And neither of these will do for al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is only rescued from his skepticism by the light of God, who is indeed the ultimate deliverer, munqidh, from error. Providing a solid ground for the certainty of truth, the text then moves on to extol a fourth category of knowledge seekers that is based on mystical experience and the primacy of the qalb, the real nature of man's spirit, which is the seat of his knowledge of God, he writes. The Sufi way of life, states al-Ghazali, cannot be learnt from simple study, but must be lived holistically, which explains why he chooses to give up teaching and live as an aesthetic wanderer for so many years. The basic mystical insight conditions his approach to the question of prophecy and the availability of truths beyond reason, beyond rationality. Only this allows for the grounding of knowledge, the resolution of skepticism, and the affirmation of belief, and indeed the reorientation of the very principles of everyday life, so that when al-Ghazali does return to his normal or previous life, he is radically transformed. And you can see that in this quote here. Yes. Okay. In myself, I know that even if I went back to the work of disseminating knowledge, yet I did not go back. To go back is to return to the previous state of things. Previously, however, I had been disseminating the knowledge by which worldly success is attained. But now I am calling men to the knowledge whereby worldly success is given up. It is my earnest longing that I make myself and others better. I do not know whether I shall reach my goal or whether I shall be taken away while short of my object. I believe, however, both by certain faith and by intuition, that there is no power and no might save with God, the High, the Mighty, and that I do not move of myself, but am moved by Him. I do not work of myself, I am used by Him. The echoes again with Augustine are palpable in this passage, but so too are the three same levels of concern. What is the basis of certain knowledge? What is its social implications? And how can it help the individual in their personal salvation? Again, a reflection on the similarities between the texts does not mean ignoring their differences, but it does help us to see, I hope, how tradition works, or how Islamic thought as a category can actually make sense. The concern for certainty that is displayed in the two texts and their mobilization of different integrated methods of reasoning is always pegged in the final analysis to Scripture, to the Quran and the modular example of the Prophet. This, then, is what puts the Islamic in Islamic thought. And it is also in light of this imperative that al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers and theologians before and after him spent so much time examining and elaborating upon the meaning of the proofs of prophecy. In other words, if knowledge is a deep and treacherous sea, as al-Ghazali eloquently describes it, tradition is what anchors the seeker on her journey through this life to the next and delivers her to safety by God's will. The task of reading and interpreting these texts in their details I leave to you to do in your sections, individually and collectively and hopefully repeatedly. I hope that these texts will stay with you forever, for the rest of your life, and your children's, and your children's children's, and so on, right? But like all of CVSP's curriculum, these are texts that are central and must remain with you. And before I free you, I should like to draw your attention to a few very broad pointers that are crucial, especially in this day and age in which we live. In other words, what makes these classics, in my view, worthy of inclusion in our CVSP canon. First, both these texts demonstrate, without a question of a doubt, that it is unhelpful to think in terms of strict dichotomy between reason and revelation. The traditional division between al-manqul and al-ma'qul strikes me as more interesting and a more fruitful space for analysis. Secondly, and similarly, it is simply impossible, as a result of the deep and the wide intermingling described above in relation to tradition and late antiquity, to speak of cultural borrowing, or of a particular science, theory, or idea as belonging originally to a specific group or a people, the Greeks or the Persians or the Arabs or whoever it may be. What is more interesting is precisely to trace how these ideas were lived and adapted over time. Thirdly, and finally, combining the 2 points above, when it comes to pre-modern knowledge structures, it is deeply problematic to imagine a monolithic or coherent concept of something called religion that's battling it out with another self-evident or independent concept called philosophy. As we see in the case of Al-Ghazali, even his supposed rejection of philosophy was wittingly and unwittingly philosophical, and in fact highly original and influential in subsequent philosophy, both Eastern and Western. And I hope that many of you will go on to do higher degrees here at AUB in philosophy and Islamic studies, history, etc., that will allow you to pursue these questions further. To conclude, what is perhaps most inspiring and insightful in these authors, and if you are to remember just one thing from this lecture, if everything else kind of was just boring and went over your heads, try to remember this, okay? It's the value of polymathesis, rather than the increasingly narrow specialization of our academic lives. I'm an engineer, I'm a doctor, I'm a historian, etc. And its division into arts and sciences. Al-Ghazali and Al-Ikhwan too were polymaths. They were scholars who viewed knowledge as an organic and a complete whole, who were accordingly able to discuss and draw on a broad range of topics and subjects to think through the issues of their day as deeply involved citizens of the world. This concern with an all-rounded education, incidentally, did not belong to Muslims alone, but was a feature of pre-modern knowledge full stop, including in Western Europe. What mattered crucially was the purpose to which knowledge was put, and by extension, its ability to instruct its bearer on the meaning and methods of living a good life, an edifying function, in other words. Accordingly, the perfect man of Ikhwan al-Safa, the man Al-Ghazali aspired to be, find echoes in the Renaissance man of European humanism, leaping forward towards our very own liberal arts at AUB. Education is also about edification, and this is the very raison d'être of CVSP, and this is why you have to listen to me on this fine Tuesday afternoon. Thank you for your attention.